Welcome to the fourth panel in our conference on how wars end. The theme for this panel is about the conditions that have to exist for a war to end. The timing of the end of wars, other than through absolute military victory or defeat, is often determined by what has been referred to as their ripeness, or the right conditions for ending war. That is, there can be a point in warfare where circumstances lend themselves more readily to their conclusion. Our first speaker is Professor William Zartman of Johns Hopkins University, who is widely credited with being the father of the idea of ripeness, or the right conditions for ending wars. Professor Hugh White, AO of the Australian National University, is our second speaker, and he assesses the opportunities for a future war, what might prevent it, what might limit its scope, and what might bring about its resolution. So let me start by introducing our first speaker, and I'm delighted to introduce Professor William Zartman. William Zartman is the Jacob Blaustein Distinguished Professor Emeritus of International Organisation and Conflict Resolution and former Director of the Conflict Management and African Studies Program at the Paul H. Neitz School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, Washington, D.C. He is a member of the steering committee of the Processes of International Negotiation program at Klingendale in the Netherlands. Professor Zartman helped create the peacemaking focus for the International Peace Academy, of which he was a member. He initiated negotiation courses at the State Department's Foreign Services Institute and was on the steering committee of the Foreign Services Institute negotiating project, co-authoring two FSI books, International Negotiation and Perspectives on Negotiation. He's also a founding member of the editorial board of the Journal of International Negotiation and is convener of the Washington Interest in Negotiations Group. Professor Zartman was a project director of the case studies on negotiations at the SAIS and co-author of the Panama Canal negotiations and the Algerian negotiations processes. Professor Zartman.
Well, it's good to be here in Australia, particularly on a day like today, which is miserable going into the winter, and I gather you're going into the summertime. So I wish I was there, but the best I can do is look at myself on the screen, and we'll have to go through that for the next half hour. Most wars end by negotiation. Clausewitz probably could have rolled over on the other side of his bed and said, negotiation is war by other means. Since most wars are conducted between two parties, war-ending negotiations are primarily bilateral. Parties come to the conclusion that war is costing them more than it's winning or likely to win, and so decide on negotiation, a ripeness question. But negotiation to end wars are a three-ring circus or a three-ring caucus. In addition to the negotiation between the sides, each side has its own negotiations to handle the triple question: who speaks for each side and who is able to deliver compliance? That's the valid spokesman question. Shall we negotiate by being tough or accommodating? The toughness dilemma. And what is the acceptable outcome? The enough question. All related, but separate questions. Thus, the matter of war termination involves the major questions of negotiation analysis. The ripeness question is the broadest consideration of coming to a war's end. Parties in a war make a calculation, explicit or implicit, of cost and gain of the enterprise. Current scholarship seems to focus on the question of why weak parties begin wars, but this is just a small segment of the larger cost and gain question. The tricky thing about this calculation, of course, is that it has to do with projections, that is, uncertainties about uncertainties, not with any figures verifiable until well after the fact. But there are also even greater complexities about this question in wartime because it must be answered by both sides when each party's calculation depends on the others, and each party may feel that it is doing better in the conflict than the other is or than it really is. Yet negotiation, even in wartime, is occasioned by a common sense that the conflict is in a mutually hurting stalemate, and in which the unilateral pursuit of a solution is unpromising and painful, costly, and the possibility of a shared way out is a shared perception. Such projections are not only difficult to calculate to a point where a decision is possible, but they're even more difficult to communicate to the other party. In the absence of direct announcement, it is more likely that each side will rely on intelligence findings or on secondary signs such as losses in money or lives or in support that may be internalized by the party for the basis of a sense of the MHS. But above all, hurt, stalemate, and way out are subjective perceptions. The only objective reality is the action taken by the parties on the basis of these perceptions. Once the negotiations are in course, the opening of the end game could also be considered and analyzed as a ripe moment when the parties find themselves in a potentially mutually hurting stalemate within the process, if no agreement is reached, and see a mutually enticing opportunity as a way out. In this sense, ripeness for closure is not an externally defined contextual situation like MHS, but an internally created stage that built up by the process itself. If we fail now, we will all be worse off. Discussions of ripeness tend to focus on the element of hurt and losses with less attention paid to the estimates of gain and future goals. Such considerations involve questions such as, what are we in this for? If we can only hang on, things will be better in the future. No gain without pain. And we can't give up now, the gain is worth any cost. These are among the most difficult uncertainties because they involve not only costs and goals now, but the uncertain costs of uncertain attainability in the future. Even if a stalemate now is admitted in a situation of increasing cost, a goal can make all pain bearable. The result is that a mutually hurting stalemate can be clearly conceived at a time when the perceived gain line dips below the rising perceived cost line. Gain line coming down, cost line going up, but the heuristic image of the lines hides a multitude of woolly uncertainties. Furthermore, these lines are clothed in a number of substantive and procedural wrappings of ends and means that further complicate the clear image of a crossing point. Finding a ripe moment within the ripe moment shifts the negotiation to the insides of each party, beginning with the question of valid spokesman. These pullback perceptions and decisions will be taking place during the continued and even renewed campaigns to support the war effort, hence rising the bar for the acceptance of a course when its course has been assiduously nurtured up to this point. However, in fact, public and supporters' opinions of war may well change before those of the leader. This consideration in turn brings an additional element not always considered in the conception of ripeness, and that is the valid spokesman question. Mutually hurting stalemate has often been accompanied by a change of leadership that introduces a change in courses possible. If not, it requires one party to find a spokesman in the other party who is willing to entertain a mutually hurting stalemate and engage in negotiations, and who is also able, that is valid, to bring his party along with that decision. The toughness dilemma is also a procedural question that shapes the decision to talk and runs along with any negotiation process. Is it better to hang tough to improve the outcome, but risk the danger that there be no outcome at all, or to lean soft to improve the chances of an outcome, but lessen the chances of getting a good share of it? The choice of tactics influences the other party's choice, and shifting approaches become confusing. Among the modes of negotiation, hardliners frequently adopt zero-sum attitudes, use a distributive style and negotiate by concessions, whereas softliners seek positive sum attitudes, pursue integrative negotiations, and negotiate by compensation or trade-offs. Significantly, both parties, and this will be important as we discuss cases, both parties can also consider construction, that is, reframing their goals in a way to make them fit into a joint agreement without changing their substance of outcome. Each of these goals include a range of behaviors and tactics involved in turning the discussion to the end of war and into a joint agreement then to do so. The enough question is the substantive companion of the previous tactical questions. There is no clear notion of a bottom line or red line in negotiation, despite its frequent reference. The job of negotiation, like the job of war, is to move the other party's bottom line while defending one's own. This far and no further can indeed be the prelude to a tactical retreat and deals among compensation to improve others to one's total outcome. Thus, a party does indeed have in mind a whole range of outcomes, from the lowest acceptable payoffs now to the broadest goal in the future horizon. If there is anything that gives a solid reference for acceptable goals, it is the outcome that what a party could achieve without negotiating. That is the BATNA, the best agreement, best alternative to a negotiated agreement. But parties often conduct negotiations and also warfare against each other's BATNA if they cannot inflect positions directly. Fait accompli often change the game board, and what was considered the best alternative available without negotiation no longer is. In addition, BATNAs can be considered the best proxy for power. If a party can get enough of what it wants without negotiating, then it is in a stronger position than if it needs negotiating and hence has to pay more to get what it wants. Thus, how much involves a degree of the goal, in some sense, that the party is willing to settle for. It also involves the price. How much does one have to pay to end the war by any combination of means, the cost of the gain in the final settlement compared to the cost of continuing the war? The two sides of the enough question. Does a party have enough to pay for peace compared to what it is paying to wage war? And when does one get along with to an end to hostilities? Violence is the coin or bargaining chip of one or both parties, which it seeks to trade in for a realization of its gains. Most frequently, it's the club of rebels who want to trade off on violence, while the government seeks to recover the monopoly of legitimate use of force, but give up its use against the rebels. The juncture of the two sides of enough brings consideration back to the crossing of the two lines of cost and gain. No longer a beginning of the ripening process, but toward the end, as the parties bring their two answers together in an agreement to ostensibly end the war. These conceptual questions, calculations that the parties make as they are moved to a consideration of continuing or ending the war. There is no telling where they will come out, but there's an understanding of what they have to go through to get there when they do. There is a final dimension, as indicated in the beginning. These calculations are not simply between the two sides or parties, but they are also going on within each party. Parties have sides. One of the concepts of the valid spokesman indicated, one of the concepts is the valid spokesman, indicating that there are other spokesmen who are not valid, and that validity is a contested value. There is some recent work on fragmentation of parties in conflict, but the subject has only been indicated and not fully pursued. The question discussed above have their place in each side's internal debates, but there is no clear structure to the analysis of these local negotiations, which I haven't been able to really go into here for problems of time. These basic concepts have been laid out rather sharply to get the ideas clearly across, but the concepts are square and reality is not. Its shape and boundaries are always muddy. As with any tools, it's worthwhile trying them on reality to see if they can cut through the fog of war and the marsh of peace and address the problem of getting from one to the other on the ground. Several cases will be evoked, even briefly, and I'm not going to go into the individual cases. I don't have any time to do so, but I do go into it in the written comments, which you may have seen, and I'll recall to you, and then you can recall to your memory of the cases, the 4 cases that I'm looking at. The case of Colombia, where an agreement among the elite parties back in the 60s led to the exclusion of the rural poor from politics. And so they rose as a campesino revolt and then became a communist, a Marxist revolt, and became in 1960 the FARC, 64, the FARC, which pursued conflict against the government. By the 1980s, they had found that there was an important possibility of means for them in the drug trade, and the means took over the ends for a while, but then came back, and they then went through with the government a series of attempts, practically by every president, to negotiate some kind of agreement, but it only came after these attempts only came to reality after a long military campaign by Alvaro Uribe, president, and his defense minister, Juan Santos. And then Juan Santos is an interesting case, a valid spokesman, because he changed his mind rather than, and changed his position, but didn't change himself. Santos then opened up the possibility by gently talking to the FARC of a search for a way out, and the FARC felt that it too, by a change of by two changes of leaders, that was caught in a hurting stalemate, and they went on to negotiate an end to the war. The Southwest African case was a case of the League of Nations mandate that South Africa had over Namibia, Namibia to be, and the conflict was carried out essentially by the by the Cuban army on behalf of Angola against the South African Army, South African Defense Force, which was invading Cuba, and coming finally to a point, the Battle of Cuitacano in 1986, where they found that they could not dislodge each other, and therefore opened the idea of a hurting stalemate. It was more complicated than that. The Cubans increased the number of troops that were in Angola to about the number of troops from South Africa, 50,000 each. And then 2 other things happened. There were white body bags that went back to South Africa from the conflict, and the Cubans sent a double message, one publicly and the other by intelligence. South Africans found out. The one was if they were going to keep this up, they would do hot pursuit into South African territory, but they were sick of the whole business. They didn't find the Angolans were good communists anyhow, and so under the extraordinarily patient mediation of Chester Crocker, negotiations began to end the war. The case of Mindanao is another interesting case where a characteristic of Philippine politics is that you never do, in fact, you try to undo what your predecessor had done as president. And so a predecessor would, or a president would come a step closer to an agreement with the Moro National Liberation Front, and then the successor would undermine that with a campaign, usually one that failed eventually, and then the next one would come in with another attempt at negotiation, and on they went until they got an agreement, and then the MNLF split, and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front appeared and got started new negotiations. At the same time, the South African Supreme Court said that the previous agreement was unconstitutional. That started the process going again, but the parties had shown that they were willing to negotiate to end the war, and they did. Interestingly, the next president that came in campaigned on a criticism of the agreement, but curiously, he came back anyhow and ratified it after some more parliamentary problems. Afghanistan is a complicated case. I say something about the first Afghan war, which is even more complicated than one might think. But the second Afghan war is worth considering a little bit. The emergence of the Taliban brought in the ISAF and the United States into an attempt to defeat the Taliban. Both sides refused to negotiate for a while, and then gradually the government of Karzai, first of all, Ahmed Karzai, tried to do some negotiation and got nowhere, which was proving that he was hurting and maybe even stalemated in a sense. But the Taliban turned that down, and then after an attempt in 2011 and in 2018, a new attempt at negotiation was begun by the United States with the Taliban. There was never any ripe moment or mutually hurting stalemate in this war, while the military command continued to claim the possibility of an eternal, or at least Afghan, until the Afghan army was properly trained, presence of 2,500 troops in the area would be enough. It was the United States and allies, like the Soviet earlier, that were deeply hurt and stymied politically, which the military did not understand, not militarily. And the Taliban was never stalled on the ground. It paused in the wintertime because the weather was bad, but there was always the possibility of a good offensive in the spring, and that took up again. The search for enough took 2 years of off and on negotiations in Doha, during which the Taliban gradually acquired more and more territory. Several secret talks were begun, and then continued in 2018, as I said, and President Trump announced that the American troops would withdraw, which changed the negotiating balance on one hand, and declared that a commitment to end the war, declared a commitment to the end of the war, but on the other, but it did not remove any bargaining. But on the other hand, it removed any bargaining chip that the United States had. The US said, we will withdraw if we can come to an agreement, and if we can't, we will withdraw. It was clear that which side felt a stalemate. In this situation, the parties reached an agreement, which the Taliban political leader in February 2020, for a pledge not to allow Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, the original purpose of the 2001 invasion, and an agreement to negotiate with the Afghan government in exchange for a full ISAF withdrawal by October 21, leaving no means of holding the Taliban to its terms, which it did not. The way to end this war was to end it, full unconditional withdrawal, except for those left behind. It's most important to note that in no case did, let's see where I am. I'm sorry, stop for breath. These are only 4 cases. but they provide a good deal of clarity to the conceptual question in the beginning. Wars are dichotomized or pluralized conflicts of force, where the parties begin to doubt that force will win for them, and they share these doubts. They then can consider negotiations, and the confrontation broadens to include the issues of enough, not just the relations of force. That decision may well be a bit waffled and unsteady, but its continuity depends on forward movement in the discussion and on reminders of the dangers that will return to force if the parties were to fall backward. The more stable the conviction on both sides that neither can win militarily, or that the military effort is still needed until the other agrees to a peaceful solution, the more likely a war-ending agreement becomes. The likelihood is not a certainty until the agreement is signed and then implemented, but progress to the end does carry a certain momentum. In all three positive cases, an awareness of ripeness required a long conflict and mounting losses to be convincing. In the negative case, it appears that strong ideological convictions on both sides that we must win and we dare not lose prevents ripeness. Since that decision and then forward progress requires a policy reversal on both sides, a valid spokesman is crucial. In all cases, action on perceived ripeness and a reversal of former policy carried with it a change in leadership on one or both sides. The change involved negotiations and dynamics that went on within each side, and it is here that the toughness dilemma and the enough question entered into strength. Debates were settled by retirement through death or elections when the persuasion failed. There has not been enough space here to take into account these internal negotiations, except to indicate what was involved. It is most important to note that in no case did enough require a change of goals by the parties, only the means to those goals. Goals could be redefined, but fundamentally remained unchanged. Clark wanted agrarian reform and participation. Colombia wanted an end to violence and punishment. A change of leadership on both sides was necessary to bring out ripeness and to carry its conclusions into action. Both parties in Southwest Africa wanted withdrawal of the opponent's troops. One party did win over the other in the case of Namibian government, but the victory was soon followed by the momentous change underlying the issue of South African government. Not part of the negotiation, but influenced by what went on in Namibia. In Mindanao, the Moros wanted high autonomy. The Filipinos wanted an end to conflict without secession. It is hard to deal with the complexities of the first Afghan negotiation. In the second war, the Taliban's goals remained unchanged, and the US fell back on its goal of 2 decades ago on the removal of Al-Qaeda. And they talked past each other, and the Taliban got there first. The Taliban's BATNA was takeover, which they got. The United States was withdrawal, which they threatened the Taliban during the negotiations, and which it got in unseemly haste. If one does not give up, if one side does not give up, and if continuing the war is deemed painful and pointless by both sides, the parties look for another way to define and attain their goals. This requires some sense of a policy and leadership change, but it ends in trading in violence for some goal achievements, thus breaking the original stalemate and cutting the unacceptable losses. It's not worth it. We're getting nowhere for our losses. Let's both try another way to cut our losses and gain our goals. That way is negotiation.
Bill, thanks very much. That was extraordinarily rich. Can I ask a question about the valid spokesman question. Speaking as a military, an ex-military person, and I was brought up, and indeed every staff college in the world teaches about the way about defeating one's enemy through breaking their cohesion by attacking their command and control, rather than through straightforward attrition. And this somehow has fed very easily into the concept of targeted killing, of killing the enemy's leaders. We've seen it with drone attacks in Taliban, against Taliban, for example. We saw it in Iraq against, not so much by drones, but by special force target operations against leaders of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Now, to a certain extent, some of these operations might well be necessary in order to stop you from losing. But at the same time, the targeting killing campaign, killing leaders, and we see it again also Israel against Hamas, must reduce the ability of the other side to be able to create the valid spokesman. And therefore, by not losing, you're also undermining the possibility of establishing a mechanism for peace. Is there a way, particularly for military people who don't really understand this issue of valid spokesman and the importance of nurturing valid spokesman, is there something that can be done to try and find an inflection point between not losing and establishing a mechanism for finishing the war?
Yes, there is. And as in all things in this topic and many of the analyses, it's much easier to tell you what to do than it is to go out and do it and apply it accurately. But the answer to the question is you talk to the political leader and you give him enough to carry home and say, look, Ma, here's the coonskin, and therefore outshadow the military leader. And that's what we did in Doha, and the result is what we see now in Afghanistan, a lot of not only problems with the ISIS, but also between the military and political leaders. Let's look at the cases. In Namibia, in Namibia, it was South Africa's political leadership that was dominant over the military. And you have a good, well-functioning government. The political civilian control of the military is what makes the decision, and the military carries it out. In Angola, it was the political military leadership of the Cubans in one person, and therefore that was the valid spokesman that they talked with. In Mindanao, I think the same thing was true. I think they talked to the politico-military leader. Where else were we? Usually, so what I'm saying as we add it up quickly is often it's the same person. And if not, it should be in a well-functioning organization. It should be the political leadership that comes out on top, and the negotiations help. And here's the tricky one: that help the political leadership come home with some goods from the talks, maintain its ascendancy without delegitimizing it by talking to the enemy. And so I leave you in that delicate balance.
That is it's a tricky situation. Bill, thank you very much. As Richard said, that was a very rich presentation. There's a lot to unpack there. Related to spokespeople or representatives of organisations, there's also the question, I think, of the unity. So if a government is defined by a monopoly on the use of force, and a counterparty in a negotiation must also represent within their own sphere a similar monopoly on the use of force, in order to have be able to get some unity. I guess that there's that point and how that's achieved. There's also the related question of how to deal with spoilers, that is, individuals or groups within the respective parties who actually want to undermine the process in some way.
Well, let's take those two things apart because I think they need slightly separate answers. The first question about the rebels' legitimate use of force, of course, is legitimized in the rebels' eyes and is illegitimate in the government's eyes. But it also leads us to that very tricky question of whether the rebels are expected to lay down arms or not. And we know, you go back to a number of negotiations, I think of Northern Ireland, where that was the sticking point. We're not going to use them, but we're not surrendering. Negotiation is not surrendering. We're not surrendering. And so we're going to keep our arms. Otherwise, we would be giving up not only the possibility of going back to conflict, which you're worried about, but also symbolically the equality that we have in the negotiations. And that's a tricky one. The government is perfectly legitimate in a broader ecumenical Weberian sense that to insist on the rebels giving up their arms. And it becomes a sticking point that has to be dealt with very carefully. That's all I can say. That's one of those woolly questions, and it has to be walked through. And the question of spoilers, here again, I think it's wonderful. Analysts, theoreticians, conceptualists have the perfect answer to the question of spoilers. It's very clear. You should include the spoilers in negotiation if they are strong enough to upset the outcome if left out. And you should leave them out if they are not strong enough to upset the outcome, and then you go ahead and make an agreement with all those and the middle people with whom you can agree. But of course, that is a clear conceptual answer that is so difficult to apply in reality. How do we? That's again an uncertainty about uncertainties. How do we know whether they are strong enough to leave out? My favorite case, which has no answer, was the Arusha agreement in Tanzania, but the Arusha agreement about Rwanda, where the mediators, the United States and others, said you've got to include the Aguzu, the RCD, I believe, in the negotiations, or else they're going to spoil the agreement. And the rebels, the Tutsis coming in, winning the war, said, no way, they're out to kill us. And so we keep them out. And so they killed them. We had the genocidea and we had the big genocide. Would they have been able to have been tamed by being in the agreement? No, they probably would have most likely torpedoed the agreement from the inside rather than the outside. So a no-win situation, but you had to make the bet one way or the other. And we made, they made a bet that was proven to be wrong, but that doesn't say that the other bet would have been wrong either.
Bill, thank you. What I liked very much in your talk, the way that you described such concepts as shared way out, mutually hurting stalemates as just simply perceptions. And the only thing that's actually concrete are the actions that actors take on those perceptions. And I was just wondering, looking at a conflict from perhaps an international actor's viewpoint, trying to do its best to help bring the war to a close. Is there anything that can be done really from the outside to try and change those perceptions, through the kinds of, media operations, psychological operations, and what are from outside? Or are those perceptions really, in reality, just simply driven by the dynamics of the conflict itself, rather than all of the other stuff that goes on the outside?
Well, there's a good and a bad side to the answer to the question. Outside parties can take, let's say, mediators or some third parties can take actions that keep the stalemate stuck. In other words, face it, they can arm one of the sides that gets, send arms to one of the sides that seems to be in a weakening position at the moment. And this is the role that, this is part of the role that the United States played in the October War, when the Egyptians had gotten across the canal and so on, and then the Israelis were coming back, and the United States continued to arm Israel to make sure that it was very complicated, that it was still in the war, it's still pushing the Egyptians to the sense of a stalemate, and that it still felt good, even though it was magnificently defeated by the Egyptians. So the Egyptians felt great for getting across the canal, and they were beaten back, and then they realized that that was a problem. The Israelis felt terrible getting across the canal, and so the American attention and arms and so on made them feel great again, because they were really in the conflict as they always thought they were being. That's the bad action. The good action is, yeah, you can talk to them. I mean, mediation, negotiation is above all persuasion, and so you can talk to them and you can try to convince them that they're really stuck, that they can't win in this. Don't you see? And it's costing you a lot, don't you see? And this is what Chet Crocker did for 6 years. I mean, it's incredible in Namibia. He said you can't, to both sides, you can't win. This is going to go back and forth. You're just stuck in there, and therefore and then he came up with the idea there is a way of mutual phase withdrawal of the same amount. So a positive aspect to that. Pushing into a slightly related way of talking about it, a mediator's first job is not simply to come up with a solution and sell that to the parties. His first job is to ripen the conflict. First job is to get the parties to see that you can't win. But like any good answer that I'm coming up with, they're very clear. The trick is that the parties may say, hey, that's not what we think. Why don't you get out? And the living case of that one is the two wonderful mediators, Kofi Annan and Lakhdar Brahimi in Syria, where they said it, their first job is to get the parties to see you can't win. So Lakhdar Brahimi then, meanwhile, Kofi Annan worked on a plan, what would happen if they did see themselves stuck in a stalemate and then left. And Kofi Annan came in and he said, and I quote to Assad, you can't win this. And Assad said, get out. I'll never talk to you again. So that was the cost of being honest and trying to do the mediating. And the result is that, of course, there was no mediation. The conflict kept on going and on, things like that. And one can even carry that further and go back to the first, to my first answer. And so the Russian, then Assad was on the ropes. So the Russians came in, but the rebels were on the ropes too. And the United States did not come in. And so what we've got now is Assad in a terrible position, and the Russians in charge of his country, and the war continues, and the good guys have done terribly.
Thank you, Bill.
You ask a simple question, you get a long answer.
No, they're great answers. Thank you. Very detailed. Just a quick one. From my experience, the first principle of negotiations is the parties do have to want to be there. And I think you illustrated that with Assad, that he wasn't interested in participating in a negotiated process. I guess that raises, and that goes back to questions of ripeness and so on. But is there a mechanism by which parties can be brought to the table, perhaps by external powers, external interests?
Well, yeah, they can be brought. I talked about how they could be brought to see the hurting stalemate. They can be brought to the table. I mean, let me go back to Assad. Russia, they kept saying at these meetings, go to the table. I mean, come on, at least go to the table. And so Assad then finally went. It took them a couple of years, and everybody said, is he going to go to the table this time, and so on. But finally he went to the table. He didn't say anything, wouldn't talk. Then finally, a couple of years later, under the third de Mistura, the third mediator, they went to the table and they talked to say no. So you can carry, and kicking and screaming was in fact Brahimi's phrase. They went to the table kicking and screaming, but it didn't change anything. You force them to go, and they feel that they must hold on. Whether they can now or not, they must. We dare not give in. It's amazing as we sit here, rational people talking to each other, that somebody can be moved by that emotional commitment. And in Assad's case, it was by a personal and national attachment to the Taliban. I mean, of course they must. They dare not give in because God said so. God said he's going to win. Why should I give in? We'll wait till springtime and we'll knock you over the head again because God says so.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's answered it. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much. That's all I have. So I think we come to the end of our session. So Bill, I'd like to say thank you so much.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be here. I enjoyed talking together. I wish we could do more, and I wish that, of course, that I would be there for with other people, because there must be some other doubts somewhere. But thanks a lot for the occasion. It was good to be here.
And that was Professor William Zartman. Now we have Professor Hugh White from the Australian National University. Hugh White is Emeritus Professor of Strategic Studies at the Australian National University, where his work focuses primarily on Australian strategic and defence policy, Asia-Pacific security issues, and global strategic affairs, especially as they influence Australia and the Asia-Pacific. Professor White has served as an intelligence analyst with the Office of National Assessments, as a journalist with the Sydney Morning Herald, and as a senior advisor on the staffs of the Defence Minister, Kim Beazley, and Prime Minister Bob Hawke, and as a senior official in the Department of Defence, where from 1995 to 2000, he was Deputy Secretary for Strategy and Intelligence. Professor White was also the first director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Here's Hugh.
Well, good morning, and thanks very much for this chance to contribute to the conference. How wars end? Well, how wars end depends, amongst other things, on who's fighting them and what they're fighting over, what the stakes are. And I want to focus in this discussion on a very particular case, and that is the case of great powers fighting over major questions of international order. This is, I think, in some ways the limiting case, the toughest case of wars. When great powers fight over major questions of international order, you tend to get the biggest wars, and in many ways the hardest ones to end. If we look back over the history of the 20th century, at least, it suggests that wars like this, wars between great powers over major questions of international order, tend to end with the destruction of one or other of the combatants' political regimes, and indeed the destruction of their political systems. If we look at World War I, this occurred by internal collapse after the battlefield defeat of the Central Powers, Germany and Austro-Hungarian Empire, complete collapse of their political systems, and a complete reconstruction of their political systems. In World War II, the same thing happened, not just after battlefield defeat, but after actual occupation of the major combatants, the major Axis powers, Germany and Japan. And one could say, if one stretches the definition of war a little, if one regards the Cold War as a war, one could say that the Cold War too ended with the destruction, not just of a regime, but of a political system, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, not just the collapse of the communist regime, but the collapse of the Soviet Union territorially as well. And that suggests that there's something pretty absolute about the way in which these kinds of wars end. The sorts of things that sometimes work to bring lesser wars, if I may put it this way, to an end, the mutual restraint of the two parties, mediation by a third party, or intervention, military intervention by a third party, by an outside player. Those are the sorts of things that often bring smaller wars to an end, but that doesn't seem to happen in the big case. Now, the reason why I think it's worth focusing on these big cases is that today we have, I think, two clear candidates for a great power war between over key questions of international order. The first is between the US and Russia, and the second is between the US and China, because both Russia and China contest the US-led order and the US role globally in some really significant ways. Of these two, I'm going to focus on the US-China example. It's not that I don't think the US-Russia example is interesting. I think it is, but I think it's less significant, both globally and to Australia specifically, than the US-China example. And that's partly because China is stronger than Russia. It's a great power, if you like. And secondly, more significantly, because the stakes are higher. Russia, in its challenge to the United States, challenges the US role in Europe, and in particular, the US role in Eastern Europe. And indeed, it challenges the European order in Eastern Europe, but it doesn't challenge the European order as a whole. China, I think, does challenge the US role in Asia, at least in East Asia, and the East Asian order as a whole. So I think it's a first order strategic challenge. It's also, of course, an important point that whilst neither of these two potential conflicts are highly improbable in the present situation, it seems to me the US-China one is seriously probable. The drift towards escalating strategic rivalry, you might say more than a drift now, the race towards escalating strategic rivalry, the danger that will escalate into an actual conflict is, I think, really quite high. And it is worth just pausing to note that if it happens, that would be the first great power war since the Chinese and the Americans faced one another in Korea in the early 50s. And because China was in the early 50s only a kind of a half of a great power, it's the first full-scale great power war since the Second World War. So what are the stakes? And this is important, as I said. What matters in determining how a great power war ends is, amongst other things, the stakes. And sometimes, though not in recent history, but sometimes great powers fight over relatively small stakes. I think we can say since the 19th century that the only situation in which great powers have gone to war has been when there have been at least fairly significant stakes of international order involved. In the present situation, if we look at the US-China conflict, superficially, the stakes would be something like Taiwan. I think Taiwan is the most likely, though not the only possible trigger for a conflict. But the status of Taiwan would not be the real issue between them. The real issue between them would be the question of primacy in East Asia, which of those two powers will be the dominant power in that very important and dynamic region. For some people, indeed, to be an argument that the stakes are even higher than that it not just concerns East Asia, but Asia as a whole, or the Indo-Pacific, as some people call it. For some, certainly some in the US, it's seen that the stakes are global. That is, the question is not just whether China takes America's place in East Asia or in Asia as a whole, but as the globally leading power. I myself don't think those are the stakes. I don't think it's credible that China can challenge the United States globally. I do think it's credible that China can challenge the United States in East Asia. And even if that's right, even if my relatively modest view of the scale of the challenge is correct, a successful challenge by China to America's position in East Asia, a successful attempt by China to take America's place as a leading power in East Asia, would have very big implications for global order, because it would mark the eclipse of America's hopes, expectations to maintain its own position as the globally primary power. It would introduce a genuinely multipolar global order, very different from the conception of global order that we have been operating with, and certainly that Washington's been operating with since the end of the Cold War. And so the stakes really are very high. They're very high for both sides. For China, achieving hegemony in its own backyard in East Asia seems to me to be a first order strategic and indeed national priority. And for America, at least so far as we can tell from what Washington says, but I'll come back to that, maintaining its position in East Asia, both in its own right and because of its significance for America's claim to global primacy, is also a first order question. It's hard to imagine, in other words, the stakes could be much higher. So what kind of war would it be? Well, the first point to make is that, contrary to what some people think or hope, there's very little chance, it seems to me, that this would be limited to a sort of a quasi-war, a grey zone war, or a cyber war. It seems to me that the stakes are easily high enough for both sides to have clear incentives to escalate beyond grey zone kind of clashes to a full-scale conventional kinetic conflict. And that's partly informed by the fact that both sides have continued to invest so heavily in the capabilities required for such a conflict. It seems to me to be highly implausibly optimistic to imagine that the US and China could find themselves in a confrontation over an issue like Taiwan, and both sides willingly restrain themselves from using the kinetic forces, the traditional conventional forces, which they've so obviously built up. Second point to make about the kind of war it would be is it would be a maritime war, not a continental war. And that's a bit different too. This would be the first full-scale maritime war we've seen since 1945. And it would remain primarily maritime, at least so far as it was a conventional conflict, in part because the United States today, as for so long in the past, really has no substantial capacity to conduct a great power land war on the continent of Asia. As a maritime conflict, it would be primarily focused on questions of sea denial and sea control. America's primary objective in that war, at least in its opening phases, would be to achieve the sea control required to project power, air power, land power to a certain extent, into the theatre, into the Western Pacific, into China's littoral. For example, in a Taiwan contingency to provide support to Taiwan. China's aims would be to prevent it happening. China's aims would be to achieve sea denial. Now, the really critical point to make about the way in which that war would unfold is that these tasks, the operational objectives of the two sides, are highly asymmetric. China's task is a lot easier than America's. It's a lot easier, partly just on grounds of geography. China is the local power. It can operate from home bases. It has a vast base infrastructure in its own territory. It's operating at short range from those bases over the key battle areas in the Taiwan contingency, for example, or even in the South China Sea. And it makes a huge difference to the amount of combat power that China can sustain in the battle space, that it's operating so close to home. The United States, on the other hand, has to operate a long way from home. It has to operate from a relatively small number of rather distant bases in Japan, in Guam, perhaps if it gets lucky, in the Philippines, who knows, maybe even from Australia. These are very distant bases. The difficulty for the United States of sustaining platforms and systems in the battle space is therefore much higher. So China has a huge asymmetric advantage geographically. It also has a huge asymmetric advantage operationally, because in order to achieve sea denial, in order to prevent the United States projecting power by sea, China has an easier task. It needs to find and sink American ships, and very long, very deep trends in technology stretching back right to the late 19th century have made it progressively easier to find and sink an adversary's ships, and conversely harder for the defending side to prevent the other side finding and sinking your ships. And the third point to make is that China has exploited these inherent asymmetries in the geographic and operational situation by the way it's developed its capabilities over the last 25 years. It's very well prepared to fight a sea denial campaign against the United States. Now, one could spend a long time unpacking how that might play out, but just to cut to the chase, the outcome, the combat outcome, the operational outcome of the first weeks of the US-China conflict over an issue like Taiwan is therefore very likely to be inconclusive. Both sides will have sustained a lot of damage, and both sides will have inflicted a lot of damage on the other. It's no part of my argument that the US does not remain an extremely formidable country, particularly at sea. And even with the disadvantages that I've mentioned, it would still manage to inflict a lot of damage on China. But both sides, however, as I say, would have inflicted a lot of damage on the other. America would have lost some major ships, probably have lost some carriers if it was unwise enough to project any into the battle space, which does not seem to me to be self-evident. And both sides would also have found themselves, I think, impelled to attack one another's bases. For China, that means America will have attacked bases on the Chinese mainland, at home, so to speak, in China. For America, it means the Chinese will have attacked Guam, will have quite likely have attacked US bases, or the bases the US are using in Japan, perhaps in the Philippines if the US gets access to the Philippines, and perhaps in Australia if the US uses bases in Australia. And that is that contributes, of course, to the stakes on both sides. Once the conflict begins, there are not just the stakes that I talked about earlier, but even higher stakes because of the fact that the conflict has already imposed so much damage. It's also worth noting that there are immense collateral consequences for this conflict. For China, of course, trade in and out of China has stopped dead. And for the United States, and for that matter, everybody else in the world, trade with China, and no doubt probably trade throughout the Western Pacific, has also stopped dead. So the global economic implications of all this are very, very serious indeed. And just to make one point very briefly, I don't think it makes much difference to the outcome I've just sketched whether or not the United States receives much support from allies. I think it's the only ally from which it's likely to receive any significant support is Japan. Even if Japan decides, which I don't think we can take for granted, to provide the United States with a lot of combat support, full support of the Japanese self-defense forces, I still think the combat outcome is unlikely to change very much. China's capacity to impose very heavy damage on US and Chinese and Japanese power projection forces moving into the Taiwan Strait, for example, would remain very formidable. And I don't think even with Japan's aid, the United States could achieve a decisive victory. And so the question becomes, what happens then? Once a conventional stalemate is reached, neither side, both sides have received a lot of damage. Neither side has inflicted enough damage on the other to compel the other to back off. And we therefore have a very costly and seemingly irresolvable combat stalemate, and at a level of violence and loss that's not comparable to anything we've experienced for a very long time. And it's happened fast. This happens within a few weeks at most. So where do we go from here? Well, I think it's very hard to see one side or the other backing off at that point, because I think the stakes are so high. Very hard for either the United States or China to back off. Nor is I think there much scope for a negotiated settlement, for two reasons. First of all, on the sparking issue, for example, Taiwan, it's very hard to see a 50-50 outcome. It's very hard to see a situation in which both sides can walk away with something. Either Taiwan is brought home to China or it isn't. And so I don't think there's much scope for a compromise there. And also, of course, on the broader point, because the objectives and stakes for both sides go well beyond Taiwan, I do think it's very hard to see in the midst of a war, the US and China moving towards some kind of negotiated settlement of their long-term power relativities in East Asia. So that's very hard to see the war ending that way. It's also difficult to see the war ending by both sides accepting the stalemate. Sometimes countries do accept stalemates for very long periods. You could say, in a sense, that's what's happened over Taiwan since 1949. But because the economic costs are so high, because the military costs have been so high in the weeks of war that's preceded the emergence of this stalemate, I think it's very hard to see the two sides sort of settling into a sustained years-long, decades-long stalemate of the sort that we do sometimes see elsewhere. And of course, Korea in some ways is another example. It's also very hard to see any outsiders being able to mediate. These are, after all, the world's two strongest states. I don't see any capacity for a third party to mediate between them. And I think that exhausts the options except for escalation. And I do think escalation becomes a very likely outcome. China's escalation options don't seem to me to be very attractive. I don't think there's much that Chinese can do. It certainly can't attack the continental United States. There are not many other US possessions or high-value US targets within easy reach of China. China itself would have to start trying to project power by sea in order to do much. And then all of those asymmetries that work in China's favor that I've mentioned would start working in America's favor. But America might think it has some escalation options. And I think these might be the key to where the war goes from the position of stalemate I've described. One option might be what one might call a conventional bombing campaign. A sustained pattern to carry the war from the sea onto the land, not by attempting a land incursion, which I don't think the United States has the capacity to undertake, but by undertaking a sustained program of bombing. I just think of conventional bombing. I do think that's extremely unlikely to have any effect on China. The target set is too big. America's capacity to deliver high explosive is too small. And we know from the experience we have, certainly from the Second World War, that it's very hard to achieve a decisive strategic effect by sustained bombing campaigns, even on the massive scale that was used against Germany and Japan in the later years of the Second World War. Some in Washington think that a blockade of China could work. That is a possibility, I suppose, but it is also worth noting that the history of the 20th century makes one very cautious about the capacity of a blockade to have a significant strategic impact on a continental power like China. Blockade did very little to slow Germany and not that much even to slow Japan, and Japan is not a continental power. The third hope I think that some people might hold is for an internal insurrection. That is, that the Chinese people, seeing their leaders fail to achieve victory, might rise up against the Communist Party. There do seem to be people in Washington who believe this might happen. Well, of course, anything's possible. And it is, in a sense, what happened in 1918 after the decisive battlefield defeats of the last year of the war. But it's worth making the point that the internal insurrection only toppled the Wilhelmine regime after a decisive battlefield defeat, and I don't think the Chinese are going to suffer that. And it did come at the end of 4 years of war, not 4 weeks of war. So I think it's very unlikely that any of those options would deliver the United States a way of ending the war. And that, of course, leaves nuclear weapons. I do think there's a high likelihood that in the situation that I've sketched, the United States would find itself considering the use, or at least the threat of the use of nuclear weapons against China. And there is, our experience of nuclear weapons is very, very slight, but it seems it would not be surprising if they believed that this provided them an option for ending the war on terms that they found satisfactory. And this is, of course, a deep part of US strategic doctrine, under debate again right now, as we speak, as to whether the United States should abandon the policy which it's maintained ever since the Cold War, that in the event of a failure of conventional forces to achieve its strategic objectives in a conflict, the United States would be willing to use nuclear weapons first. I think there's plenty of evidence that this possibility looms quite large in American thinking about how they would terminate a war with China. My view is that this is unlikely to succeed, and it's unlikely to succeed because I don't think its threat of using nuclear weapons against China is credible, because the Chinese have a high level of confidence in their capacity to retaliate against the United States with nuclear weapons of their own, and they have a high level of confidence that capacity will be sufficient to deter the United States from launching a nuclear attack, and therefore a threat of nuclear attack from the United States would do little to pressure China. Now, there comes then, of course, a very deep question about classic nuclear strategic terms of the sort that we were so familiar with during the Cold War and have tended to forget since, about whose threats are more credible than the others, under what circumstances could China be deterred from retaliation by threats of counter-retaliation, and so on. But I do think the bottom line is pretty clear. No US president could be confident that a threat of nuclear escalation against China would be credible to the Chinese, because the Chinese would believe they had a chance of deterring a US attack by threats of retaliation. And that raises the deep question as to whether the United States would be willing to contemplate accepting retaliation as the price for winning a war with China over an issue like Taiwan. After all, the United States, under previous leaders in different situations, was willing to do that during the last Cold War. Would they be willing to do it again? Well, that gets us back to the question of stakes. How high are the stakes here? My own view is that for the United States, the stakes here against China, high as they are for the reasons I mentioned before, are not as high as they were during the Cold War, or at least as they were perceived to be during the Cold War. Because during the Cold War, their threat from the Soviet Union was perceived to involve the potential for a direct threat to the US homeland, which was perhaps always arguable, but at least was more credible in relation to the Soviet Union than it is in relation to China. Not because the Soviet Union was stronger than China is today, it certainly isn't, but because China is more powerfully balanced by other powers closer to hand than the Soviet Union was. The Soviet Union was weaker than China, but it was a lot stronger than its neighbors. China is stronger than its neighbors, but not sufficiently stronger to be able to have any chance of achieving the kind of dominion over Eurasia that the Soviet Union was well placed to achieve, had it not been contained, particularly in the early decades of the Cold War. If that's right, if the US can't find a way to resolve the battle, to resolve the battlefield stalemate that I've sketched by a credible threat of nuclear escalation, then there are only two possibilities. One is that the US backs off and accepts defeat. And I do think that's the more likely outcome, because in the end, I don't think the stakes are high enough for the United States to risk a nuclear war over China. And they're certainly not as high for the United States as they are for China. After all, this is China's backyard. If we were having a debate about or a discussion about a US-China conflict in the Caribbean, the boot would be on the other foot, and I would predict it the other way around. But I think in China's backyard, China's stake is higher. The US probably backs off. But the alternative is that it doesn't back off, and that it does threaten a nuclear attack. And if China doesn't respond, it finds itself compelled to undertake a nuclear attack, which of course nobody wins. So how does this war end? I think it ends in one of two ways. One is it ends with the destruction of the United States' position in Asia, because its credibility is destroyed by its inability to successfully prosecute a conventional war with China. The other is a nuclear war, which ends up having, I think, in effect, the same long-term outcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, well, Hugh, this takes me back to my teenage years watching these apocalyptic films about a nuclear attack by the Soviet Union on the West.
Oh, yes.
But
The morning after.
Oh, they terrified me. As you know, we're looking at the consequences of a period of power transition and a challenge to a previously dominant power. And I was wondering, you know, in the past, and I think now, we've tended to blame the rising power for the challenge, rather than the dominant power for not being willing to accept a changed balance of power relativity, as you say. Britain, for example, would not accept that Germany might have a navy that might challenge British global naval power, but it's traditionally blamed Germany for that challenge rather than itself for not accommodating Germany's rise. I'm wondering if you'd like to reflect more generally, you know, have we seen any circumstances, or can we imagine any circumstances in which the declining power just says, right, this is a changed international order. It's inevitable, nothing remains static over the centuries. Is that at all a possible option for the United States?
Look, Jane, it's a really good question. I think it is a possible option for the United States, but as you suggest, it doesn't seem to be one that's been very often taken advantage of. The best example people often, or the example people often offer of a consensual transfer of power is Britain's willingness to allow the United States' rising power to take some of Britain's place around about the turn of the last century. And you know, that's often held up as sort of a consensual power transition. I actually don't think it is, because I think it mistakes the nature of the choice that the British faced. Because Britain, around the turn of the last century, didn't face one rising power in the shape of the United States. It faced three at least. Mm. It faced Germany in the heart of Europe. It faced Russia, which was a real, well, you know this better than I do. You're the historian of the First World War. Russia was a real rising power before the First World War, and notwithstanding the ups and downs of the Russo-Japanese War and so on. And of course, it faced Japan. And so Britain had to make the choice: which of these four rising powers was at least unhappy about, and America was the easy call there. So I think you're right. There's very little historical very few historical examples of countries doing that. And I think one of the reasons for that is that, you know, we do tend to, if I can put it this way, moralize our interests. There's a great line in Carr's The 20 Years Crisis, where he says there's a great tendency to imbue the status quo with moral significance. Exactly. Which I think is I've always thought a great point. Now, it's not to say that it's not to assume that there is moral equivalence. It's not to assume that a Chinese-led order in East Asia is morally equivalent to a US-led order in East Asia. I personally would prefer to live under US hegemony than Chinese hegemony if I had to make a choice. But the fact that you know, in the end, America's position globally has been a result of its power, not a result of God or the founding fathers or anything like that. And that as power shifts, relationships change and countries rise. That is something that can't be got away from. And it does seem to me that the only sensible thing to do is to make whatever accommodations you can within some ill-defined but very significant limits to try and accommodate a rising power. But all I can say is the chances of that happening in Washington today, short of a real crisis of the sort that I've attempted to sketch there, is very low. And I can speak of this with some personal experience because, you know, nearly 10 years ago, I wrote a book called The China Choice: Why America Should Share Power, which argued precisely this is what America should do. And I would have given, I suppose, 50 different presentations to different audiences in the United States, from you know, the Council of Foreign Relations on up and down. And I never received anything other than the most, well, polite, because they're Americans, but disbelieving. What? You want us to share power with China? Why would we do that? Well, because they're going to be stronger than you. Yeah, why would we do that? So the refusal to acknowledge that the dynamics of power, it seems to me to be a very serious, and it's there today in Washington. You know, I think Washington has declared a new Cold War with China without thinking at all clearly about how that war can be prosecuted and how it can be won, whether it's won as a Cold War or a hot war. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm gloomy about where this is going.
Yes, well, make America great again. It just speaks to that, you know, the notion that you can reverse major structural change in the international system and revert to the previous order.
Yes, that's quite right. Yeah.
I mean, Hugh, at risk of you know, moralizing our interests, as you call it, I mean, you've talked about the contest in terms of power and hegemon, but actually, what we're looking at is a conflict. Well, arguably, we're looking at a conflict between or contest between political orders, between what we might loosely describe as, you know, Western-style democratic liberalism against authoritarianism, and living in a region which potentially could come up under an authoritarian yoke, if you like, if this war occurs and goes the wrong way, then actually we do have something to fear from it. Are the stakes actually, as you describe, about power, or are we actually talking about political orders here?
Well, I wouldn't. Let me. I mean, it's a really good question, but let me just contest the premise of it. I'm not sure there's a big difference between the two. So let me go back a couple of steps. Are what we're seeing here primarily a contest between political orders? Well, only up to a point. Let's just do a thought experiment. Imagine if all of those people who assumed back in the 1990s and even into the 2000s that as China grew more prosperous, it would become more liberal and would become more like us. So imagine a situation in which China today has the economy it has today and the sense of China that it has today, which has very deep roots, not just a matter of ideology there, but it's more democratic. It's sort of, you know, gone the sort of South Korea route or, you know, something like that. Is that China necessarily easy to live with? Is that a China which says, yeah, sure, no, America should be the dominant power in our part of the world. Why not? Well, I don't think so. What makes China challenge the US-led order is not that it's communist or even that it's Chinese. It's that it's or authoritarian. It's that it's normal. It wants to do in East Asia what America did in the Western Hemisphere, after all. Yep. You know, I mean, I do think there's a very close analogy between what America, you know, America's determination to be the sole dominant power in the Western Hemisphere, and China's desire to be the sole dominant power in the Eastern Hemisphere, in the East Asia. There's a marvelous line in Kissinger's book Democracy, in which he said, what makes the relationship between the US and China as so striking is that they're so similar. And what makes them similar is that they both desire not just to dominate their political system, but to be the political system in their region. And I think there's a profound truth in that. So that's just to say, I don't think life would be any easier if China was, so to speak, more democratically governed, or at least we would still have the contest over primacy in East Asia, whatever China's political complexion. But on the other hand, and this is where I think your point is absolutely right, the stakes for us as bystanders, well, not as bystanders, as very closely involved participants, would be very different, because one of the reasons why a transition from a US-led order in East Asia to a Chinese-led order in East Asia is frankly frightening, and I think it's frightening, is that the way in which China exercises its power, our judgments, our expectations of the way in which China would exercise its power if it becomes the dominant power in East Asia, our expectations must be shaped by the way in which we see the Chinese exercise power at home, and it's not reassuring. We can expect China to be a pretty ruthless and bullying regional hegemon, and that's a very important consideration for us. On the other hand, it doesn't, to my mind, settle the issue, because it's not enough for us to say we don't want China to become the dominant power in East Asia. Of course we don't. The question is, do we not want it enough to be willing and able to do what will be necessary to prevent it becoming the dominant power in East Asia?
Absolutely.
And the present posture of the Australian government seems to me to be, I think this is clearly implied by a lot of what's been said, is that we are willing to go to war with China to prevent it becoming the dominant power in East Asia. And I would make 2 points about that. The first is that that war would be extraordinarily costly, and we must, in morality, balance the costs of that war against the costs of the benefits we're seeking to achieve. And if we, it's tempting to think, well, these things are not relatives but absolutes. There was if we use the World War II analogy, the Munich analogy, the 1938-1939 analogy, we see the Nazis as a kind of absolute incarnation of evil that had to be resisted at any cost. And I'm not unsympathetic to that. But the question for us is whether it's best to see China, for all our fears and anxieties about it, as a reincarnation of Nazi Germany, or something more like Wilhelmine Germany in 1914, goes back to Joan's point. It's possible that the right thing to do in 1914 was to say to Wilhelmine Germany, look, okay, you guys are pretty big. You're going to be a more powerful country globally and in Europe, and that Britain should learn to accept that. And after all, that's what almost half of the British cabinet in the first days of August 1914 were actually saying. We can live with this. And had the rest of the people sitting around the table in the cabinet room at number 10 been given a snapshot of what the next 4 years was going to look like, and for that matter, had the Australian political leaders sitting in Melbourne been given a snapshot of what this was going to look like, they might have said, actually, no, I think we'd rather live with a risen Wilhelmine Germany, even leaving aside the fact that that failure led to Nazi Germany. So I think it's an extraordinarily complex issue, but I think the key thing for us to recognise is that it's not as though the morality is on one side and the power's on the other. There's morality and power on both sides of this thing, which needs to be weighed. And part of that is not allowing ourselves to oversimplify our judgment about China. I think the CCP are a very sinister bunch of people, but I'm not sure I think they're so sinister that I'm willing to fight a nuclear war to stop them, particularly because we're not likely to win it.
Exactly.
And in the end, call me old-fashioned, but I'm really reluctant to start a war that I don't think we're going to win. And of course, and the good guys don't always win. I mean, as it happened, we won World War I and World War II, and we won the Cold War. But my goodness, I mean, we could have lost World War I, and we could have lost World War II, and we could have lost the Cold War.
And as you say, Hugh, there's this incredibly difficult question of the cost versus the so-called gains. I mean, the famous British historian A.J.P. Taylor said, would you rather be a betrayed Czech or a liberated Pole?
Yes.
And the cost of war and I think World War II certainly demonstrated that, can just be so out of proportion to any political gains that might be achieved. But back to the question of the relative morality. As you know, I've often taken issue with the idea that Australia should ally itself with the United States because the United States is dedicated to, quote, a norms-based international order. That's often said to me. I see very little evidence, and I'd be willing to hear you correct me, that the United States has demonstrated since the Cold War much commitment to a norms-based international order at all.
No, look, I would agree with that, or rather, they're committed to their norms, which include, of course, the right to make war contrary to the UN Charter when it suits them, and so on. And so I don't regard the United States as a perfect international player, and I do think their use of power is more ruthless than is sometimes given credit for. I think one's view of US power is well, no country has. We Australia, I think, have benefited to an unusually high degree for the exercise of US power, and I've always been a strong supporter of the US alliance on those terms. But I don't think we should for a moment presume that the US always gets things right or always does right, which is a different point. But I think whatever one's moral judgment about the United States is, I would still very happily embrace continued US leadership of the East Asian and the global order if I thought that was going to be sustainable. But I don't. No. And if it's not going to be sustainable, then the debate about whether, where they stand on the spectrum between good guys and bad guys, between Mother Teresa and Nazi Germany, how far along that spectrum you go, I easily put them, further towards Mother Teresa than the Chinese. But the fact is, I just don't think that can be sustained. And I don't think, going back to the point you made before, I don't think it's worth fighting a war with China, which we're not going to win, in order to preserve their order.
Hugh, you mentioned a couple of things which interest me. One was that the position of allies, that in terms of the combat outcome of any conflict, they would almost be irrelevant, apart possibly from basing. And presumably when we're talking about allies, we don't just mean Western allies, and I know China doesn't have allies, but it has partners, of Russia, of course, is one.
Yeah.
And you mentioned right at the beginning that one of the conflicts, potential conflict, great power conflicts, is between the States and Russia. And I just wondered whether that is one of the escalatory options that China does have, in fact, is to expand the pressure on the United States geographically through encouraging Putin adventurism in Ukraine and the Baltic states in order to stretch US capacity.
Yes, no, that's a really interesting point. I don't, well, there's a couple of points to make. The first is, I don't see China's lack of allies as a weakness the way many other people do. America needs allies because it's trying to sustain a global posture. If you want to project power into Central Europe, if you want to project power into the Western Pacific, then you need to have local allies just for basing, quite apart from the sort of politics and optics of it. It's an engineering problem, and getting access to territory is a solution to that problem. So I don't see that as a weakness. The second point I make is that I don't see the China Russia relationship as an alliance in any very strong sense. There is a clear temporary, not necessarily to say transitory, but temporary alignment of interests, because they're both in their own regions seeking to contest US primacy. And they both benefit from the undermining of US credibility in the other's space. So the fact that America doesn't come to Ukraine's rescue, it helps undermine the Taiwan's confidence or Japan's confidence, or for that matter, Australia's confidence, it'll come to our rescue against China and vice versa. So there are clear alignments. On the other hand, there are clear limitations. In the end, they are neighbours. And in the end, Russia has a strong interest in China, not a strong interest, an absolutely overwhelming objective to prevent being dominated by China, which is not these days a trivial thing. And so Russia does face a huge question as to how it manages the problem of China's power. This is just a little bit anecdotal, but I spent a very interesting few days in Moscow in late 2019, in which I talked to Russians, experts and people in government and so on, about how they felt about China's growing power. And I was surprised by how many of them expressed such confidence in America's capacity to contain China. and I said, well, here's the bad news, guys. I don't think that's going to work. I think the Chinese are going to win the contest for East Asia for the following 17 reasons, and laid out the arguments, including the military argument. There's a lot of other arguments as well, but the military argument I've sketched to you earlier here. And what struck me was how surprised they were by that analysis, perhaps coming from an Australian, but also how quickly they responded by saying, well, whatever else happens, of course, our absolute determination is to preserve our position as a Eurasian great power. And so I think in the long run, the grand sweep of history, Russia's real role in life is to help us contain China rather than to assist it. However, that doesn't at all, Richard, rule out the thought that one of the things that might happen in a US-China conflict over Taiwan is that Russia would not so much, I think, at China's urging, though I'm sure the Chinese would be happy enough, but at its own sense of opportunism, would you take that as the opportunity to make mischief in the Baltics or wherever? And I do think that would pose a terrible, terrible problem for the United States, because I think it not actually in terms of the distribution of, well, actually, no, that's wrong. Actually, I mean, the forces directly engaged would not be the same, because a conflict with the Soviets, sorry, slip of the tongue, showing my age, with the Russians over the Baltics, over or whatever, would be fundamentally a continental battle, and the war with China would fundamentally be a maritime battle. But America would have to go to a huge effort to protect its maritime lines of communication across the Atlantic in the build-up for a conflict with the Russians over one of the Baltic states, for example. I don't think America can win that war. I mean, it's a different argument from the one that I made about China, because it's a different war. But I've done a little bit of work on that and engaged in a few conferences with NATO friends and colleagues, and much to their surprise, I think, when I put that together and try and build an operational concept, I don't see how the United States, or NATO for that matter, can put enough capability in the field to prevent the Russians achieving an easy fait accompli against any or all of the Baltic states.
Absolutely.
And of course, with a very real risk of nuclear escalation there, and all the same arguments apply as the ones I applied earlier. So I do think that's a serious complication for America. But the bottom line is that only makes my gloomy conclusion even stronger. And it makes it even harder for the United States to be confident that it can win a war over Taiwan.
Hugh, from both Jen and myself, thank you so much.
That's been a great pleasure.
Sobering, but really, really insightful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity.
So on that rather sobering note, we complete this panel on the conditions for peace, or ripeness. Thank you to our two highly distinguished speakers. The next panel in our conference on how wars end is on the modalities, the mechanisms for building peace. We hope to see you there.